je vous remercie beaucoup d'être là pour cette conférence. Mais avant tout, je voudrais remercier Hal Foster, qui a accepté donc l'invitation de Paris 1 et du département dans lequel j'enseigne, l'École des Arts de la Sorbonne, pour venir donc nous présenter sa recherche en cours. Je remercie aussi l'INHA et son directeur, qui ne va pas tarder de venir, de nous avoir accueillis ici, dans ce nouveau, très bel amphithéâtre. Donc évidemment, il est inutile d'introduire Hal Foster, dont les écrits ont été des compagnons de pensée pour nombreux entre nous ici. Et nous avons passé, je pense qu'on est très nombreux aussi à avoir pensé, les avant-gardes avec le Dieu prothétique sous le coude, dans les oppositions et les rapports inversés avec des machines célibataires traumatisées après la Première Guerre mondiale et juste avant l'avènement du fascisme. Des titres de textes de Hal Foster comme L'artiste comme ethnographe ou Archival Impulse se sont tellement établis dans l'historiographie, dans l'écriture, dans la critique, qu'ils constituent finalement des catégories aujourd'hui avec lesquelles nos étudiants doivent réfléchir. Alors, Hal Foster, il est inextricablement historien de l'art et critique, et j'insiste sur ce double rapport d'un point de vue d'abord temporel, dans la mesure où il pense toujours le passé à partir du présent et le présent dans la longue durée. Donc, une pensée généalogique, une pensée qui essaye de penser, une pensée donc qui essaye d'élaborer, de réfléchir avec des tournants, avec des revivals, avec tous ces spectres finalement qui hantent nos vies psychiques et intellectuelles dans ce long XXe siècle qui est notre préhistoire à nous aujourd'hui. Alors, depuis quelques années, Hal Foster semble obéir à cette même nécessité avec une certaine urgence, dans la mesure où l'urgence devient, je pense, finalement le concept qui réunit tous ces travaux depuis quelques années, à commencer par Brutal Aesthetics, qui est donc son ouvrage le plus récent et qui est l'ouvrage qui est issu des très prestigieuses Mellon Conferences à la National Gallery of Art à Washington. Donc, Brutal Aesthetics, encore un projet de très long cours qui a été donc incité par cette réflexion sur la pauvreté de l'expérience pensée par Walter Benjamin et par la notion d'une barbarie positive. Après le barbare, la banalité. Donc, encore une autre catégorie qui va nous faire nous déplacer des années 50 dans cette après-guerre avec lesquelles nous n'avons toujours pas fini, les années 60, sur lesquelles donc Hal Foster va nous parler ce soir, et je pense que nous ne manquerons pas de penser à une certaine actualité avec les pensées qu'il va nous présenter. Donc, merci beaucoup, Hal, d'être ici. Merci de ta générosité. Et nous sommes très contents. Et évidemment, après, il y aura une discussion. Donc, nous comptons sur votre réactivité.
Thank you so much, Maria. I'm so happy to be here, and thank you all for coming. I'm so sorry to speak in English. It would be very painful for you if I spoke in French. But the good news is that my talk is brief. I expected disaster with the American elections, and they were not as catastrophic as I thought they would be. So I'm actually in a good mood, and I hope you are too. It's very relative, these moods. Okay, so when I go like this, it's a quotation, not a benediction. So I will begin. This talk is prompted by two coincidences that have troubled me for years. The first coincidence involves the use of the same word, banality, in two controversies in the early 1960s. One controversy was political, provoked by Hannah Arendt with her famous analysis of the trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem, which appeared in the New Yorker magazine in February and March 1963. The other controversy was aesthetic, prompted by the rise of pop art, which was the subject of a symposium at the Museum of Modern Art already in December 1962. The proceedings were published in Arts Magazine in April 1963. Arendt intended her notorious phrase, the banality of evil, as a neutral description, not a moral judgment. And this enraged her critics all the more. Why? What did banality signify to them? Meanwhile, the opponents of pop art condemned it as banal. The word was not at all neutral for them. Why did they use this term in particular? What did it evoke? Why did these two controversies, otherwise separate, converge on this one word? My second coincidence concerns minimalism. 20 years ago, I visited the concentration camp at Buchenwald, which is located not far from Weimar, the idyllic town of the great humanists Goethe and Schiller. There in a shed, I stumbled across two stacks of iron rings that at first I mistook for a sculpture by Karl Andre or Eva Hesse. This misrecognition called up a jarring line from an interview that Hesse gave in 1970, just a few months before her premature death, in which she says that the metal plates of her friend Andre grabbed her insides more that they were the concentration camp for her. Strangely, Hesse, who had fled Nazi Germany as a little girl, intended this remark as high praise. How could that be? What did she mean by it? What possible connection can there be between the Andre plates and the gas chambers? Let me take up the two controversies one at a time. The first has to do with the superficiality of pop images, and the second with the seriality of minimalist objects. But the two also overlap. Given the provocations of Arendt and Hesse, it will not surprise you if I place pop and minimalism in relation to historical trauma, specifically that of superficial subjectivity and serial death. But why return to this old problem and these familiar practices more than 6 decades later? My reason is simple. As Gerhard Richter once remarked, pop and minimalism altered the alphabet of subsequent art. In many ways, they set the terms for the dialectic between art concerned with image and media on the one hand, and art concerned with body and space on the other. A dialectic that has guided much advanced practice ever since. My hope is that my approach might suggest a new way into this old problem, that it might point to a historical trauma that both trajectories in art at once take up and cover over. Perversely, I also want to propose a utopian dimension in this otherwise dystopian connection between post-war art on the one hand and superficiality and seriality on the other. Okay, first, pop superficiality. In the early 1960s, the Arendt controversy started a civil war among New York intellectuals. Arendt was attacked for her judgments of the behavior of the Jewish leaders and Zionist officials in Eastern Europe, her analysis of the legal charges against Eichmann, and her accusations that the court proceedings were a show trial. I'm sure many of you know this. More pertinent here, her critics objected to her portrait of Eichmann as a banal cipher of totalitarian rule. Her great offense was her utter failure to render moral judgment on the mass murderer. The sense that her argument was fundamentally aesthetic, almost modernist in its concern with doubt and ambiguity, also enraged her critics. Finally, her critics suspected that her version of history was beyond good and evil, and that it disallowed any redemption in the story of the Holocaust. Some good must come out of so much evil, Lionel Abel, her fiercest antagonist, insisted, with Israel foremost on his mind. And indeed, Arendt was very critical of the Israeli government as well. For the Israelis, Eichmann was the eternal anti-Semite, the historian Anselm Robbenbach has commented, whereas for Arendt, he was the totalitarian everyman. This is the crux of the dispute about Eichmann, the person. Officialese is my only language, Eichmann argued in his defense, and Arendt largely agreed with him. He was genuinely incapable of uttering a single sentence that was not a cliché, she wrote. And this inability to speak was closely connected with an inability to think, namely to think from the standpoint of somebody else. Hence the banality of his evil. It would have been very comforting to believe that Eichmann was a monster, Arendt argued. But despite all the efforts of the prosecution, it was difficult not to suspect that he was a clown. Moreover, she continued, the trouble with Eichmann was precisely that so many were like him. Arendt asserts very provocatively that his banality was shared by countless others, and that they were and still are terribly and terrifyingly normal. Arendt labeled Eichmann the perfect bureaucrat who had identified his will completely with the law of the Führer. In his view, of course, this justified him rather than condemned him. When I speak of the banality of evil, Arendt concluded, I do so only on the strictly factual level. He had no motives at all. He was not stupid. It was sheer thoughtlessness. Hence again, the banality, his banality for her. One cannot extract any diabolical or demonic profundity from Eichmann. I believe it was this lack of profundity, intellectual, psychological, and moral, that was most intolerable to critics of Arendt. They saw her analysis as an excuse for the greatest crime ever committed. In a very different way, pop also indicated a loss of depth to its detractors. In fact, they deemed this anti-style banal 3 times over, trivial in content, superficial in form, and facile in process. A New York Times review of the second Roy Lichtenstein show at Leo Castellari Gallery in fall 1963 is characteristic of this response. The show included a work such as Portrait of Madame Cézanne, which was based on a textbook diagram of the painting. Its author later sued Lichtenstein for copyright infringement. Written by the critic Brian O'Doherty, titled doubtful but definite triumph of the banal, and punctuated with terms like vacancy and vacuity, the review presented Lichtenstein as a threat not only to the value of art, but to its very raison d'etre. The Lichtenstein controversy is really a symptom of a deep unease, only the unease was deep, a deep unease among critics, historians, and some artists as to what art is all about. Although such work was certainly not art for Doherty, he anticipated that it would soon be claimed as such, not because of any aesthetic merit, but because of its sociological interest, which was banal in its own way. It was as though, as in Blam, which was also exhibited in the show and mentioned in the review, mass culture had blown high art out of the sky, ejecting the humanist subject like the blackened pilot in the picture at bottom right. The crime of pop was not merely to register a new world stripped of significance and subjectivity, but to delight in this superficiality. Along with moral depth, according to Peter Seltz, the curator who had organized the MoMA symposium, pop had collapsed aesthetic distance. And despite the fact that Lichtenstein always insisted on how much he had transformed his commercial sources, cartoons and comics, the pop artist, the critic Max Kozloff insisted, was only the agent, not the author of the work. It was as if, for early critics, pop art was produced automatically, as if they had anticipated with horror the famous Warhol motto of a few years later, "I want to be a machine." Whereas abstract expressionism was cast as heroic by its advocates, pop was not even ironic for its detractors. It was merely complicit with the degradations of mass culture. The critic Hilton Kramer concluded his talk at the MoMA symposium as follows: "Its social effect is simply to reconcile us to a world of commodities, banalities, and vulgarities, which is to say, an effect indistinguishable from advertising. This is a reconciliation that must, now more than ever, be refused if art, and life itself, is to be defended against the dishonesties of contrived public symbols and pretentious commerce." Now, inadvertently here, Kramer points to a possible connection to the other debate about banality at issue. Already in 1937, the year the Nazis came to power, the Austrian novelist Hermann Broch called kitsch the evil in the value system of art. And in 1939, another ominous year, the American critic Clement Greenberg agreed. A product of the Industrial Revolution, kitsch was the great enemy of genuine culture, one that had become instrumental to totalitarian regimes. This fear and loathing of kitsch set the tone for the condemnation of mass culture among New York intellectuals in the post-war period, especially in the circle around Partisan Review magazine, which was riven by the Arendt debate. Across our two controversies then, there was a tacit consensus about the grave threat that banality posed to both aesthetic depth and moral profundity, and the loss of the one was seen to imply the loss of the other. On the charge of superficiality, the supporters of pop did not disagree with the opponents. The supporters simply affirmed as appropriate to consumer society what the opponents rejected as alien to high art. Soon this view was given philosophical weight by theorists such as Jean Baudrillard and Roland Barthes. In 1970, Baudrillard asserted that pop had relieved the object of its symbolic meaning, its age-old anthropomorphic status. While a decade later, Barthes argued that pop had released the image from any deep meaning whatsoever. The pop artist does not stand behind his work, Barthes wrote, and these are well-known words, and he had Warhol in mind, clearly, and he himself has no depth. He is merely the surface of his pictures, no signified, no intention anywhere. In 1968, Michel Foucault had already concluded his great essay on René Magritte with an allusion to Warhol, specifically to how his simulacral surface implied serial repetition. A day will come when, by means of similitude relayed along the length of a series, the image itself, along with the name it bears, will lose its identity. Campbell, 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 Campbell. Foucault qualified this idea a little in 1970. This is the greatness of Warhol with his canned foods, senseless accidents, and advertising smiles. In concentrating on this boundless monotony, we find the sudden illumination of multiplicity itself. Suddenly, arising from the background of the old inertia of equivalences, the zebra stripe of the event tears through the darkness, and the eternal phantasm informs that soup can, that singular and depthless face. That language is so redolent of a time, I'm almost nostalgic for it. It was left to Frederick Jameson in his book Marxism and Form of 1971 to historicize the loss of depth in relation to advanced capitalism. We need only juxtapose the mannequin as surrealist symbol with the photographic object of pop art, the Campbell soup can, and the pictures of Marilyn Monroe. We need only exchange for that environment of flea markets and street stalls that attracted the surrealists, the gasoline stations along American superhighways, the glossy photos in the magazines, and the plastic paradise of an American drugstore that attracted the pop artists, in order to realize that the objects of surrealism are gone without a trace. We might see this historical trajectory traced, say, from the Cinderella slipper spoon, a crafted object seized by André Breton in a Paris flea market as a personal talisman of deep desire, traced from this slipper spoon to the diamond dust shoes of Warhol, which are all impersonal surface. Yet this trajectory is both too quick and too final. At the very least, it skips over, I think, a suppressed middle term that lives on spectrally in the Warhol image, the shoes amassed at the concentration camps. This is a stretch, I admit, almost as provocative as Hesse linking the André plates to the concentration camps. But in Raid the Icebox, his exhibition of objects taken from the Rhode Island School of Design, there is a hint of this connection. Among the many Warhol quotes, one in particular points to his embrace of the compulsive repetition enforced by a society given over to serial production and consumption. And this is a quote you might know. "Someone said, 'My life has dominated me,'" Warhol said. "I like that idea. If you can't beat this system, he suggests, join it. And if you enter it totally, you might expose it. You might reveal the automatism of this compulsion to repeat through your own excessive performance. Certainly, his early work is an extended study of an object world structured by seriality. Dollar bills features the primary unit of equivalence in human civilization, money. Green Coca-Cola bottles underscores the serial industrialization of food in post-war capitalism in particular. Note that the bottles are not quite the same. Warhol demonstrates how repetition produces difference as well as identity. Then there is the seriality of anonymous death in the tuna fish disasters, car crashes, and electric chairs, in which Warhol exploits the seriality of the newswire photo, as well as the seriality of celebrity death in the Maryland pictures, in which Warhol evokes the seriality of the religious icon. To put it in extreme terms, the Death in America silkscreens are his version of the dialectic of enlightenment of Adorno and Horkheimer. And the American Man, a portrait of Watson Powell, who's head of a huge insurance company, might be his version of Eichmann in Jerusalem. Contra Baudrillard and Barthes, there is feeling in the Death in America images, but it is muffled. I like boring things is another famous Warhol dictum. I like things to be the same over and over again. I don't want it to be essentially the same, he specifies. I want it to be exactly the same. Because the more you look at the same exact thing, the more the meaning goes away, and the better and the emptier you feel. This is boredom as blockage, repetition as defense. With Warhol, seriality both drains away unwanted meaning and protects against excessive affect. When you see a gruesome picture over and over again, it doesn't really have any effect, he once remarked. Although one function of repetition in psychic life is to rehearse a traumatic event in order to integrate it, repetition in Warhol is not usually reparative in this way. Often it not only reproduces traumatic events, it also produces them. At least it does for me. This suggests that there is a historical subtext in this art. We might call it, after Adorno, damaged life, and that the banal images of pop serve both to express it and to mute it. It is this banality that Gerhard Richter made his own. For a time, I worked as a photographic laboratory assistant, he commented in the mid-1960s, soon after he first encountered Warhol. The masses of photographs that pass through the bath of developer every day may well have caused a lasting trauma. Yet rather than bracket this shock, which involved the omnipresence of photographs in mass culture, Richter treated it. Painting from photos was the most moronic and inartistic thing that anyone can do, he remarked about his early work. Clearly, Richter sought a disconnect from affect. It is as though the process of translating the photograph into a painting offered him a buffer against its fatal seriality. Some of the pathos of his pictures is that this treatment is too little and too late, as is always the way with trauma. Of course, Richter also employed banal subject matter as well, such as the candelabra pictured in Flemish crown, a good example of petit bourgeois aspiration. In a conversation about this painting, he actually referred to the banality of evil thesis and then commented, "I don't need to paint a monster. It is enough to paint this shitty, small, banal chandelier. That thing is terrifying. That is what makes the banal more than just banal." It's all evasive action, Richter also said of his strategy. But again, he does not avoid banality. He paints from it and through it. Painting from photographs freed him from conscious thinking, Richter wrote. It is neutralized and therefore painless. It is almost as though he had learned a lesson not only from Warhol, but also from Eichmann, and then counteracted it. The photograph provokes horror, Richter stated in 1989, with his Baader-Meinhof suite in mind, and the painting with the same motif, something more like grief. The photograph provokes horror, the painting, something more like grief. Death and suffering are always the theme carried by the photograph, he also said. If the picture remains too photographic, Richter insisted, it is unendurable. At the same time, if it doesn't register the traumatic somehow, it won't be effective. Here, as in Warhol, banality in Richter is a defense, and doubly so, a defense against historical trauma as well as contemporary image culture. And in both registers, surface is not opposed to depth. Let me turn abruptly to my other controversy, the connection made by Eva Hesse between the Karl Andre plates and the concentration camps, where surreality is again central. This provocation had precedence. In the late 1950s, Frank Stella gave his black paintings outrageous titles like Die Fahne hoch and Arbeit macht frei, both notorious Nazi mottos. And in the mid-1960s, Tony Smith alluded to the Nazi parade ground at Nuremberg as a forerunner of the expanded field of sculpture inaugurated by minimalism and then extended by earthworks. Still, the Hesse comment, which appeared in a 1970 interview in Art Forum magazine, is the most dramatic one. Asked by her interlocutor, the critic Cindy Nemser, about her affinity for any particular school of painting, Hesse mentions Jackson Pollock and Klaus Oldenburg, but she privileges Warhol. He is the most as an artist that you can be. His art and his statements and his person are so equivalent. And then she drops this bomb. I feel very close to Karl Andre. I feel emotionally connected to his work. It does something to my insides. His metal plates were the concentration camp for me. Of course, we can't know exactly what Hesse intended, yet clearly she favors art that is affectively intense, that involves a traumatic piercing of the subject. To her mind, the connection is not an analogy, much less a metaphor. The plates, she says, were the camp for her, not like it. And her use of the past tense suggests that they triggered a past trauma. This reading is supported by the fact that Hesse escaped Nazi Germany in 1938 as a Jewish girl of 2, and that she was terminally ill with cancer at the time of the interview. She died at 34, less than a month after its publication. Of course, these same facts also prepared the psychobiographical account, Hesse as Wound, that long dominated the critical literature on her work. Although this account is not wrong, it is partial, and it obscures both the political implications and the formal complexities of her art. Elsewhere in the interview, Hesse claims that the real content of her work is the total absurdity of life, which she associates with extremity. There isn't a thing in my life that hasn't been extreme. Personal health, family, economic situations. Art became connected to this, and absurdity is the key word. It has to do with contradictions and oppositions. I was always aware that I should take order versus chaos, stringy versus mass, huge versus small, and I would try to find the most absurd opposites, the most extreme opposites. Another term for this absurdity might be antinomy, that is, a contradiction that resists resolution. Certainly, Hesse proceeded by way of negation as she sought a basis for her art that would be non-anthropomorphic, non-geometric, non-non. Here she offers no mediation between her extreme opposites. Her artwork is that mediation, and her position accords with the extremity of the period, not only in her own life and in the artistic debates that engaged her, but also in the world events that affected everyone. Her friend Mel Bachner tells a relevant anecdote involving an encounter with Andre from a few years before. At Max's Kansas City, that was an artist's hangout in New York in the 1960s. At Max's Kansas City, I was introduced for the first time to an artist I had written about very positively. He immediately attacked me for misunderstanding his work. When I asked what he objected to about my interpretation, he shouted, "My work is the cry of dying babies in Vietnam. Every unit represents a dead baby." Initial detractors of Andre in particular, and minimalism in general, condemn them as inhuman. But this anecdote suggests that they're less inhuman than anti-humanist. This anti-humanism was also active, for example, when in another well-known conversation from 1966, Frank Stella and Donald Judd claimed that minimalist art had broken with traditional rationalism. And when, a year later, Mel Bachner insisted that conceptual art had erased all signs of style and metaphor. Not only a local reaction against abstract expressionism, this rejection, widespread among artists, writers, and philosophers of the time, targeted a humanism that had had no effective response to fascism, the Holocaust, and the bomb, and that continued to fail in the face of imperialist war in Southeast Asia and elsewhere. As many of you know, this anti-humanist position was programmatic in the Nouveau Roman, the literary movement favored by both minimalists and conceptualists, and it too was received as inhuman. So again, how are we to understand the brutal connection made by Hesse between the Andre plates or bricks and the concentration camps? One path is to follow Jean-François Lyotard, who invoked the sublime as a way to mediate between abstraction and the Holocaust. In his account, avant-garde abstraction witnesses the unrepresentable by not representing it. And so post-Holocaust abstraction witnesses the unrepresentability of the Holocaust by not representing it. Of course, there are problems with this argument beyond its circularity. The most serious one is that it presents the Holocaust as ineffable, beyond human understanding. And this transcendental dimension, for us, is entirely at odds with the immanent orientation of the minimalists and their followers, focused as they were on the actual parameters of art, physical, institutional, and discursive. The mediation of the André plates and bricks and the concentration camps cannot come via the sacred. So what if we see this relationship as one of absurdity in the antinomic manner of Hesse? Dialectical thinking helps here, for such thinking aims to unmask antinomy as contradiction, and thereby to reveal the interpenetration of opposites in any given situation. Thus, for example, in his bitter poem about his Los Angeles exile, Brecht presents the same place, Hollywood, as both heaven and hell, heaven for the rich, hell for the poor. Frederick Jameson forces the dialectic even further in order to grasp the utopian possibilities in the most dystopian of conditions. For instance, he has presented Walmart as a gigantic corporation that not only undercuts local communities, but also offers a new model of production and distribution that might be adapted to radically different ends. What if we attempted a similar experiment with the Hesse juxtaposition? The dystopian trajectory is clear enough. Again, this is what early critics saw in minimalism. But what utopian horizon might be glimpsed? Hesse was a reader of Sartre, at least of existentialist writings like Nausea, which informed her sense of absurdity. But the Sartre I want to summon here is the Sartre of the Critique of Dialectical Reason, the first volume of which was published in 1960. It is there that he introduces his famous opposition between fused groups and serial society. For Sartre, seriality is the fundamental condition of capitalist society, especially so in its consumerist stage, pervaded as it is by markets and media, which address us en masse, but separate us in doing so. Seriality is a plurality of separations, a multitude of alienations, Sartre argues, that are internal as well as external. In a serial world, everyone is the same as the others insofar as he is other than himself. His well-known example is a queue at a bus stop. Anonymous people, backs turned to one another, silent and indifferent. The opposite of this serial line is the fused group, for which Sartre offers the most celebrated instance of revolt, the storming of the Bastille in 1789. Significantly, Sartre sees seriality as primary. Fused groups rise out of the state and fall back into it. If individual passive alienation sometimes turns into collective active solidarity, it does so only for a time. Soon enough, groups die and then disintegrate. Serial structures were common in conceptualism as well as minimalism, and Hesse adapted such structures from both. In fact, like her friend Sol LeWitt, she pushed the logic of seriality toward the illogical. This is one more antinomy that is essential to her aesthetic. serial art is another way of repeating absurdity, Hesse stated. And curious about words as she was, she would have known that absurd stems from the Latin for out of tune, for regularity that becomes irregular. More importantly, Hesse turned seriality back towards its Sartrean opposite, fusion. Several pieces illustrated in the interview perform her characteristic drama of composition and decomposition, material concentration and formal dispersion. This tension between binding and unbinding has psychic resonances. They are key terms for Freud, and some critics have applied them to Hesse. But it also has political implications, which are not much considered. In any case, this is not an either-or. That Hesse is concerned with the serial and the fused, the separate and the united, is suggested in the titles of some of her illustrated sculptures, such as Aeneid, named after a family of 9 deities in Egyptian mythology, and Vinculum 1 and 2, named after the Latin for bond. Vinculum is also used in anatomy for connective tissue and in mathematics to indicate that a group of terms should be treated as a single entity. Aeneid consists of 9 strands of dyed string that begin evenly spaced near the top of a dark rectangle on the wall, only to fall 3 feet into actual space, where many of the strands tangle before they rise to the adjacent wall, where they are again attached. Stringy versus mass, serial versus fused. A different interplay occurs in Vinculum 1, a double ladder structure of metal screens covered with latex. The 2 vertical series of panels which rise above human height are both separated and sutured by the vinyl tubes that fall between them. Repetition 19 activates the serial fuse dynamic in another way. These 19 fiberglass buckets are both like and unlike, and Hesse allowed them to be rearranged in order to underscore the relay between individual and group. Sometimes this dynamic is staged between works, as in schema and sequel. In schema, little latex hemispheres are neatly placed on a latex square in 12 rows of 12 each, while in sequel, little latex spheres are spread as though randomly on a cheesecloth rectangle. The title suggests that sequel follows schema, but seriality and fusion are in play in both, where they are presented as bound up with each other. Since seriality runs through pop as well as minimalism and conceptualism, it was much on the minds of artists and critics at the time. Mel Bachner alone published 2 essays on the subject in 1967. Bachner deemed seriality self-exhausting and solipsistic. As a result, its political dimension goes unremarked, and no mention of Sartre is made. And this is true of other relevant texts, too, even though the problem of the serial and the fused was everywhere evident in contemporary politics. How to fuse civil rights, anti-war, and feminist movements, both internally and with each other, in a society that was ever more serial, not to mention ever more spectacular. So finally, what possible utopia might be glimpsed in the linking of minimalist object and concentration camp? The very question is offensive. But dialectical thinking is often perverse in this way, an overturning, a perversion of the accepted framing of a situation. If Hesse was antinomic in her thinking, the Marxist André aimed to be dialectical in his. My work is part of the objective condition of capitalist American society in the 20th century, he wrote in 1975. Nonetheless, I would like to say that my work is socialist art. Already in 1966, André had asserted that it is communistic because the form is equally accessible to all. Now, this thinking might seem more magical than dialectical, and given events in his later life, it's difficult to speak about André at all. Yet what is suggested here, and this is what is important for me, is that art, like criticism, but art, in order to be critical, must be immanent to its world, that it must take its forms from the structures of that world and not attempt to escape them or even avoid them. In our case here, this means that both pop and minimalism had to work with the given terms of superficiality and seriality. Superficial images, serial objects, superficial and serial people, even superficial and serial death. To work through them in order to imagine a different life beyond them. Perhaps what Hesse signals in her brutal juxtaposition of André and Auschwitz is not only the importance of affective intensity in art, but also the necessity of an artistic figuration of serial absence transformed into fused presence. This is needed now, I think, as much as it was then. Thank you. I hope that wasn't too long. And I'm happy to take any questions or hear any comments that you might have. Not that I can really see you.
Merci. Il faut poser les questions en français ou en anglais? Okay. Thank you for this talk. I was wondering, how do you introduce the question of authority in this context? I'm speaking less about Eva Hess, of course, than about Carl André. But the question of the monumental or counter-monumental, if you think that it's not above the ground, but still, the very size of the works and the kind of authoritarian aspect that it can have. And I know it's more dialectical than I seem to imply. But because in the way you're speaking, it seems to be linked with the structure of the situation, but at the same time, I think there's a position, at least in Carl André, which is trying to be above that structure, or to master it, and to organize it as something that could give him some authority.
Thank you for the question. I think that that's completely true, and as you spoke, it made clear to me that whereas with pop there was this concern that authorship had somehow disappeared, that with minimalism, authority returns with great force, great problematic force. And I think it's impossible not to see an authority in problematic authority in Andre and many of his peers. I think people see it in a related sculptor that I admire very much, Richard Serra, for example. And I would never deny that it is there. The irony for me, I suppose, is that I think that they wanted to, in the use of ready-made units, like these squares and bricks, to do away with at least one form of authority, an expressive authority. But that doesn't mean that authority somehow disappears. The question of the monument is a somewhat different one for me. And again, it's problematic, I think, to even talk about Andre, but I do think that his work is essential to my my subject, and I take the invitation from Hesse. This is a work, I didn't show it in the course of my talk, that really troubles me, but I find that it speaks to this condition of an attempt to turn serial absence into a fused presence. This is a piece that Andre was invited to do for a synagogue, as you see in Germany. Sorry about that image quality. Is it monumental? I think artists like Andre and Sarah thought that because they had done away with the verticality of sculpture, that they had somehow avoided that condition of monumentality. But I agree that I can't deny that authority is a problematic condition of such work as well. Sure.
One thing, maybe, I don't know if this is working. Yeah. Listening to you, I was just thinking that Eichmann wanted to present himself as an obedient,
right,
mediocre civil servant.
Right.
And the word servant in English, at least, is important in that sense.
Right.
But at the same time, he wanted to master the situation and to prove that he was the real master of
right,
organization and all that. And in a way, listening to what you said, I just thought there's something similar happening in Andre, maybe, and even in the blown-up form of some pop art, except in some cases. I think that the crowd picture you showed by Warhol only exists as a lithograph and not as a not as a lithograph, but as a print, not as a full-blown painting. But the rest is very big in itself, and so imposing. Even though, so there's something going on for me around that. But well, thank you.
No, I appreciate it, and I clearly need to think more about this problem.
Thanks for the lecture. I was trying to think about, so it seemed like you were dealing in this distinction of like works that the initial sort of critical misreception was to confuse the replication of serial sort of flat industrial production as an endorsement of that whole world, rather than a critique by Warhol, like a la Warhol, like living through it. And I guess I just in experiencing Warhol's works and looking at some of these others in the slides, I just wonder how, to what extent you think the works themselves sort of like push a reception in the degree of like critical versus endorsement. I don't think that's a very clear question, but
No,
yeah.
I understand. You know, at least since pop, but no doubt well before, this question is an artwork critical or complicit? It has stayed with us, and certainly for artists of my generation, my friend Abigail Solomon Godot could back me up here. For artists of our generation, like the pictures artists, this was an obsessive question. Is it critical? Is it complicit? And my response was always it had to be decided on a case-by-case basis. But I was struck by how people were not at all at ease with the idea that it would somehow be mixed, that we would somehow have to figure out, to parse the criticality and the complicity and maybe not see them as so opposite, so distinct. And I would never argue that Warhol, for example, was somehow a critical artist. I think if we saw him as consciously critical, whatever critique is in his work might be less effective. It's in the treatment of his images that a form of critique, I think, can be extracted or can emerge. It doesn't always have to be intentional. And I think that's true of the others. I mean, they were concerned, especially Lichtenstein was concerned that early critics just thought that the work was not transformed at all, that there was no artistic, let alone critical work done to the image. So that was just a misrecognition. But, criticality as a value, I think for many people that's become a problematic assumption. For my generation, it was a given as a criterion. But it has to be not exactly invented, but it has to be experienced at a different level from always conscious, always polemical, I think. And that's what I see in Warhol. What I have to say about Warhol and these other artists is nothing at all like what they have to say about their work. I don't know if that satisfies you, but that's how I think about the critical dimension.
Can I just ask a very quick follow-up, which is why do you find Warhol's critique more potent if you understand it as like unconsciously driven at, if I understood you correctly?
I'm not sure that I find it necessarily more powerful if it's somehow not stated, not evident or even self-evident. Maybe it's that it allows me to think with others about the work in a way that's not necessarily given by the artist. Maybe it's because I want a place for the critic, a place for the historian. But I do think it's there. I don't think it's mere projection on my part.
You know, I was remembering that there was a whole debate at the beginning of Sherry Levine's career and also Cindy Sherman, was it really political? Was it really feminist? Was it not complicit with blah, blah, blah?
Right.
This is now, what, 30 years on since
40.
that, the first appearance of those artists and those same questions. So I think it's important to integrate into this kind of overview the absence or the presence of artists working at exactly the same period as, you know, those artists you were talking about, you know, other than Hess, obviously. But the thing about, is it complicit or is it subversive, etc., this is not an answerable question. I mean, I think it's a question that by even asking it, you presuppose that a political practice is one that we can recognize at first sight.
Right.
Yes, thank you for this lecture. My question may be too broad, maybe, but I wonder if we could say the same things you said about repetitiveness in minimalism, but in the field of music, because it happened quite in the same time, in Reich and Riley and Phil Glass. So maybe it's too broad, but
it's a beautiful question, and one I need to think more about. I mean, I have thought about it because, in a way, seriality is most evident in minimalist music. I mean, it's clear enough in minimalist sculpture, and those composers were very close to these artists. I mean, they talked quite a bit. You know, I would love to hear more from you on this question because I really do need guidance. But I especially with Steve Reich, I think it's absolutely essential. I mean, I think of an extraordinary piece. This is not from the 1960s, but a piece that he did titled "Different Trains," in which he juxtaposes voices recorded on trains from New York to California, which he took as a little boy, with accounts of trains to the camps. So there, it's almost too direct. It's not at the level of form or structure. That's overlaid with actual content. But I wonder if in the moment of the emergence of minimalist music, whether an argument could be made like the argument that I've made for minimalist art. And it's Reich, Glass. I mean, these are Jews, and they perhaps that question of serial death is somehow in the work. I don't know. I mean, I haven't really figured out a way to begin to think about it, but I would love to know if you have any suggestions for me.
Yeah, I haven't thought before about this aspect of their work. For me, it was more linked with something architectural, because they all lived in Manhattan, and it's a very repetitive city in the architecture and in the urbanism. Also because I'm an architect myself, so it's my, my lens of seeing things. But clearly, Different Trains was about exile and stuff like this. But it was a later piece that he did not make in the 60s. So
I think it would. The way to begin, I think, would be to go back to the anti-humanism of minimalism, both the art and the music. I mean, the rejection in serial music of any humanist tradition in music. But again, I haven't thought it through at all. But thank you for the question.
Thanks so much for the talk. I think it was one of my favorite pieces by you, actually, because I felt history was really present in a way that I either hadn't noticed before or was just super evident tonight. It was really enjoyable, so thank you for that. I'm very interested as someone who works on propaganda in like sort of extremes of seriality, and I learned, for instance, recently that Rauschenberg only did like 79 silkscreen paintings, whereas when we think of Warhol, we can't count how many silkscreen works he did. We don't know, like, because print and seriality was such a huge part of Warhol that we don't even know, really. And then the other huge backdrop to all this, from my perspective, as someone who works on the Cultural Revolution in China, is like the significance of seriality for propaganda. Particularly, I'm thinking about Mao's Little Red Book, which was printed in like 4.5 billion copies. It was more copies were on planet Earth than the Bible at one point. And that's just his Little Red Book. Like, if you think about the posters and the Das Bao and all that. One thing that's really, like, with your work is that you often talk critically about the U.S. and how U.S. is a rogue nation, but like with the rise of China right now, and I just think that I wish the criticality was more expansive somehow, because if we're talking, like, communism wasn't that great, right? It had some problems. So, like, if you're going to talk about seriality and what it means for people, like, what does it mean in a communist country in the 60s, for example? That's all.
Right. Well, I mean, this is the moment when both those orders, capitalist and communist, become, in a way, serial, as you suggest. And, you know, it was not much later, Guy Debord would say that the spectacle is universal, that they both have the same structure in a way. But my point, and maybe it's one that I need to argue more persuasively, is that artists, writers, filmmakers, architects even, dancers, that the ones that are important to me work with the problems that are presented to them. So if seriality, whether capitalist or communist, is the structure of a life, how does one kind of work through that structure to another form of life? It might be impossible. It might just reproduce it. It might only exacerbate it, make it worse. But that's my critical premise about the work that interests me the most, that it seeks to be imminent to go through. And it might be that, I mean, I've written for a long time about this strategy of mimetic exacerbation from Dada to the present. And it might be that strategy no longer makes much sense in a world of politicians that has become so outrageous, that they're their own mimetic exacerbators. Maybe the strategies that have interested me in so much art are now taken up by the right, by rightist politicians, and thus have rendered null and void some of the practices that have concerned me for much of my career as a critic and historian. I don't know. But I still take it as an article of faith, maybe only faith, that art, like criticism, must be deeply in its given conditions and has to work from those materials somehow.
Yes, I have a
comment more, but maybe a question, hopefully. And if I can digress a little from the historical and aesthetic connotations and talk about what your talk evoked in me, which was a lot of things, but specifically, and it might be a little simplistic, but when you were talking about banality, I started, and repetition as synonyms, I started thinking about everyday life, my life, the life of repetition, banality. And then I started thinking about time, which is repetition. And recently we were talking about this book, The Shape of Time, and the way time is thought of as repetition and history is thought of as the event. And I thought of fusion as the event, our lives that are constantly repeating the same thing, and then something happens, whether it's on a very personal level or on a larger level. I suddenly thought of it because of how much you were insisting on this serial aspect of things, of that seriality as being necessary, or the repetition as being necessary to lead to the event or the fusion. And another strange constellation is last night we watched this film, cheesy 90s Hollywood film called The Saint with Val Kilmer. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but there's a premise of nuclear fusion underlying the narrative. And nuclear fusion as being essentially an answer to, if we can put that to our day and age, well, now, if nuclear fusion was made possible, that it would take care of, I think, a lot of perhaps problems, energy issues, which have caused, as we see, all the chaos that is being caused because of energy. And so all these things, this utopic element of fusion and the repetition as being necessary, because I feel like, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the idea of all of this is for it to impact our lives and to impact the world, as in art, I'm talking about. And I wonder also if in this work, because I know it's an ongoing project that you have, do you eventually articulate these ideas? Is that the idea, to articulate it in kind of this type of banal, everyday context, not banal, but in a context that is outside of making some sort of references to...
No, thank you. That is helpful. I think, long before at least philosophers that I know talked about the event, I saw it in Warhol, that in his repetitions, there is, as Foucault said, the zebra stripe of the event. Suddenly there's a little rupture, a space opens up, the repetition is disturbed, and a new thing, a new experience happens. And that is important, I think. It will be important to this project when I think about pop and minimalism. But, I did maybe promise too much that there would be a kind of utopian horizon in this very dystopian world of pop and minimalism. And obviously I did not deliver it to you. But
I wouldn't say so. I mean, the fact that these things were evoked.
Right, but the one motivation of this project on the banal is that in the word banal, there are two opposed meanings. One is, the way we say banal. This is banal. This is to be rejected. But banal also means that which is common. So, banal is related to words like ban, banishment, abandon. So it's a tricky word that holds in that which is common and that which is despised, that which is, central to authority. A ban was, what a king could do. But also that which is held by everyone else. And it's that double status of the banal, the common and the outside, that interests me, and I think it's what interested artists and writers at different moments. This project, I think, will begin with figures like Kurt Schwitter's, who actually embraces banalities, and Asger Jorn, who embraces banalities, because they see in banality a way, given a mass culture, a way to find a commonality, to address a new collective. And that's, for me, is another example of artists who kind of work with what they are given, the crap that we are given, and attempt to transform it somehow. But in the name of a different way to be a person, be with people. And, it may sound utopian in the stupid sense, but I like that. I want to hold on to that promise. I think part of my interest in these questions now is, and this might seem very voluntaristic, very willful, but I want to believe that one can still think dialectically, even though dialectics were pronounced dead decades ago by intellectuals of this country. I want to believe in it because I want to believe in utopian possibility. And by utopian possibility, I mean the possibility of change, of transformation still. We're in, obviously, such a grim situation now, in all kinds of levels. And I want to look for moments in the past that might instruct us in ways to, also, very difficult moments in the past, to think and act our way through them and out of them. Because to just repeat a dialectics of doom is not sufficient to me anymore. The pessimist always wins. I have this argument with my closest colleagues, and they always win because they're the most pessimistic. And for me right now, that is just an impossible position, ethically and politically, and I want to say aesthetically. I want to believe in the future, especially because it will not include me. And fuck it, that's my position these days.
Thank you. That's a wonderful answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Hal. I am thinking about this other moment in the 20s and mostly in the 30s, when some very powerful minds like Benjamin, Krakauer, Bloch were also trying to think the possible utopia in the present, not in the future, right now, in many ordinary forms, images, etc., etc. For all these thinkers, the concept of surface was very negative. Their main critique, as you know, of the Neue Sachlichkeit, for instance, of photography or of painting, was that it was a surface painting or a surface representation, which was excluding the historical, the political, the social context. So it was an aestheticization of reality, which did not allow the critical distance. What I think that it is very interesting to try to think the valorization, because it is also a question of value, the valorization of the concept of surface and the form of surface in all those artists that you talked to us about today, which is also an answer to this eternal problem, form or ideology, critical or adaptive to a reality. To my mind, it is not a question, because actually all the work of these artists is to show, as you said, through the immanence of form, to criticize reality. And I think that it is not only, I don't think that it is something, I think that that characterizes good artists as general. For instance, Sartre, for him, history was engagement in history. It was action. It was only through action that the human subject becomes a subject. Mm. And in the same time, you have Foucault, who has this famous, argument with Sartre, and who says, no, history is not only that. History is not only subject. It is not only humanity. It is structures. It is, and I think that it is very characteristic of this historical turn, which is included in this art, and which is does not scream history, engagement, opposition, but everything goes very, very dialectic through the ambivalence of form. Mm-hmm. And I think that that is powerful. That is something that finally utopia is there, that form and spirit are going together in a way. Mm-hmm. Formalism is utopian.
That's actually a beautiful response to the question about critique or complicity. So thank you. I have nothing to add. I totally agree with you. It's beautiful.
I agree with you.
Thank you. Maybe a more banal question, and no pun intended, about the different forms, the different styles of banality, because you've shown quite a broad spectrum, actually, and to think that there's not only one direction, because maybe the most banal of all forms is the square, but then the minimalists managed somehow to brand the most banal of all shapes. And so these different distinctions and oppositions between simple and complex, or disruptive and banal, and I don't really know what I expect with this question, but how do you sort of articulate and what do you do with the extreme diversity that stems from this word banal?
Yeah, no, that's precisely the problem for me right now. How to determine what to think about, what to work with. I like the question about repetition a minute or so ago, which suggests that banality is not always the same. And as you suggest too, it's very different people, different times, and but it's this antithetical sense in the word that is my guide, that the banal is both that which is common and that which is pushed outside. And artists, I think, and writers and others are interested in the banality of their moment if it has this double quality. Because if it's outside, they can somehow bring it in the mode of a question or a critique. And if it is truly common, if we all know what is banal in our lives and we all have the same banality in a particular moment, particular place, that is a form of commonality that perhaps we can work with. There's a great moment in the Benjamin essay on surrealism, because he thought that the surrealists were very attuned to the banal. He says, what form would life take if at a decisive moment everyone sang the same street song. You know, that form of life might be horrific. It might be a fascist orgy, celebration. But it also might be a fused group of a very different sort. And I'm interested in those deeply antithetical kinds of events, experiences, works. And that's where I really want to focus on the banal, to find instances where that double meaning is very charged, if that makes any sense.
And did your work on this concept start with the realization of this contradictory nature, or did you sort of discover this along the way? And were you trying to sort of create a category, or?
Right. No, I don't want to impose this concept. I think it does emerge from the work that interests me the most. But I also want to distinguish the banal from other terms that are important too, like the vulgar, the vernacular, the everyday. But I think for me the banal is closest to the common. The common is, the way we talk about the commonplace. We say, oh, it's a commonplace, it's a cliche. But the commonplace is also a common place. It's where we can be together. And actually, Sartre has a beautiful statement on the commonplace that holds those two thoughts together. And I think that's, for me, that's really the test of the work that I think I will take up. But as I say, and as you understand, this is the very beginning of a project, so it might go poof.
Thank you.
Thank you. We should end on poof. Thank you.